So first of all, just thank you to Sarah Lucas, particularly for putting this together, and to Emily, Dan, and Robin for reading and commenting on the book. So the idea for the book very much took shape towards the end of my doctoral research, which was on how Enlightenment political theorists responded to the problem of religious enthusiasm. And one of the more interesting responses that I came across was that of Anthony Ashley Cooper, the third Earl of Shaftesbury. Persecuting religious fanatics, Shaftesbury argued, only fed their martyr complex. Ridiculing them, by contrast, could diffuse their power without compromising religious toleration, which was a key value for Shaftesbury. Now, after I finished the PhD, however, I noticed that Shaftesbury's defense of ridicule sparked a fierce debate among philosophers that lasted most of the 18th century. And the debate effectively pitted two broad perspectives on ridicule against each other. The first of these, inspired by Thomas Hobbes, emphasized the corrosive power of ridicule, and particularly its troubling association with contempt. By communicating contempt and generating fresh contempt in an audience, ridicule could humiliate its object and prompt violent retaliation. And while ridicule on this view could still be useful as a corrective to pride, the risks associated with its use were usually deemed too great. Hence, Sir John Browne, who was one of Shaftesbury's most prominent critics in the middle of the 18th century, warned that ridicule would destroy mutual charity among Christians. That's a quote. The anarchic quality of ridicule only seemed to heighten the danger, as even a well-targeted jest could have unpredictable effects. As Mary Astell put it, once let loose, ridicule shall be boundless. Now, Shaftesbury and those who followed his example made it their task to overcome these fears about the unsociability of ridicule. Part of Shaftesbury's optimism on this front stemmed from his moral teleology. Whatever is natural or virtuous, he affirmed, could never really be mocked, and any attempt to do so would make the mocker themselves look ridiculous. Shaftesburyans also judged that the threat to civility posed by ridicule was effectively overstated. So Francis Hutcheson, one of Shaftesbury's keenest followers, accused Hobbes of neglecting how humor could forge bonds of friendship and conviviality, and therefore serve the cause of civility rather than threatening it. For some philosophers in this tradition, excessive earnestness could be just as dangerous to civility as excessive mirth. David Hume thought it inappropriate to always treat religion with seriousness, because doing so imbued theological disputes with an undeserved significance and could even fuel religious conflict. Although, as I argue in the book, he placed far less faith than Shaftesbury did in ridicule as a tool of philosophical debate. Shaftesburyans also challenged the notion that ridicule was somewhat irrational or a poor substitute for argument. For common sense philosophers in Enlightenment Scotland, for example, ridicule was not inferior to reason, but rather had a different, no less legitimate role. That is, to guard common sense against absurdity. So for Thomas Reid and James Beattie, ridiculing Hume's skepticism was perfectly allowable because Hume's conclusions were not false, but absurd. Reason was powerless against them. Ridicule alone could prepare the mind to reject them. Others indebted to Shaftesbury saw ridicule as the only fitting response to certain forms of moral corruption. So for the Scottish abolitionist Alexander Geddes, the injustice of the British slave trade was so palpable that those who had the gall to defend it merited a different form of treatment than what would normally be appropriate in a public debate. To earnestly engage the defenders of the slave trade was thus to do a disservice to the trade's victims and even to reason itself. Indeed, ridicule was so powerful in part because of what it replaced. Shaftesburyans recognized that when we ridicule someone, we are pointedly not treating them seriously or with the deference they demand. Ridicule can thus function as a way of refusing an adversary's preferred terms of engagement. Mary Wollstonecraft, the subject of my final chapter, saw this only too clearly. She recognized that to argue earnestly with someone was to grant them dignity. And this was a dignity she denied to Edmund Burke, who to her mind had forfeited any right to deference after he abused her mentor, Richard Price. Although the debate that Shaftesbury started has long since petered out, the problems that it inspired are very much still with us. I think we still worry about public humiliation, while simultaneously insisting that something more than argument is needed in response to some contemptible ideas and behaviors. Taking the complexity of the politics of ridicule seriously, I argue, requires avoiding the extremes of Hobbesian pessimism and Shakespearean optimism. Even if we accept that ridicule is often born of pride and expresses contempt, not all assertions of pride are illegitimate and not all contempt is unjustified. At the same time, an upsurge of ridicule in public speech is not necessarily a sign of a free and vigorous debate. It can also reflect an atmosphere of intolerant moral absolutism. So ridicule, often seen as a weapon of skepticism, is not always that. And in a public sphere in which everything can be turned into a joke, ridicule quickly loses whatever critical or emancipatory potential it may have enjoyed. To celebrate or denigrate ridicule as such, therefore, makes little sense. As I see it, ridicule needs to be evaluated less moralistically as virtuous or vicious, and more politically as a social practice capable of producing an array of context-dependent benefits or harms. I'll leave it there for now.